I want to thank the Historical Society for inviting me to speak tonight. And the other two speakers were great. Enjoyed their history lesson. And I hope you'll enjoy the next 2 hours that I've prepared for you. You couldn't see Charlie's face, but he said, "What?" So who am I? Ray Roberts. I'm a lifelong resident of Zellwood, Florida. Been here all my life. My wife and I, Kathy, and I started our company, Central Florida Ferns and Foliage, 32 years ago, which to me is almost amazing. Seems like it's just yesterday that we started. And one thing that I'm proud of is it's truly a family business. Our son's in the business with us now. Matt, he's here tonight. And I'm soon to retire, hopefully. I tell everybody I've got the tired part down, but now I'm trying to work on the And Matt doesn't know, but recently we've been referring to him as Dad's exit plan. So how did I get started in the nursery business? Where did I learn the trade? A lot of you probably know where Riesling Vincent Greenhouses was, right down the street here. It was on the corner of Poncan and 441. Lester Vincent Florist was on the corner, then Riesling Vincent Greenhouses was right beside it. So I worked for the Vincents for several years, Riesling and Dudley Vincent, and they were wonderful people. And I'll always thank them for treating me more like family, actually, than an employee. But that's where I learned the fern business. Because when I first started working for Riesling, he was importing ferns from Europe at the time. All kinds of ferns, different types of Bostons, bird's nest ferns, staghorns, maidenhairs. So that's kind of where I fell in love with the fern business, was at Riesling's place. So I was researching kind of the history of Riesling Vincent Greenhouses. And I found out that it actually was started by his dad, Riesling Sr. And one of the interesting things about Riesling Sr. was he has ties to the Sedoni home and the Laughlin estate. He actually worked there in the 20s. He was their head groundskeeper. He was in charge of their greenhouses, their nursery, and they actually had a fernery on the property at the time. And I remember Riesling always telling the story about his dad. He would tell him that he always had to have blooming flowers ready for Mrs. Laughlin when she came into town because she had to have cut flowers for the house. So he always made sure they had blooming flowers when she got there. So there's a few other Vincents that were involved in the early fern business, and we're going to go way back into the 20s. And I don't care what you younger folks think, this is not an account of myself being there. I'm not that old. So anyway, we'll go back to the 20s, and that's where the Boston fern industry first started. So what is a Boston fern? I mean, many of you know what it is. You see them in the hanging baskets over there. But the Boston fern industry really goes back to even the early 1900s. And in 1912, they were shipping what then was the native Florida sword fern to northern growers. They would grow them on and sell to florists and garden centers. But there was this one particular time that there was a shipment of the Florida sword fern that got shipped to a florist in Boston. And this Boston noticed this one plant that was a little bit different. And so he pulled it out and he started watching it. It was different. It was softer looking, more draping, as you can see those are, where the Florida sword fern was real upright and stiff. So that's what we call in the fern industry a sport. It's actually a mutation. So the Boston fern came from that one plant that was discovered by that florist in Boston. And it got so popular in the Boston area that that's why it's nicknamed the Boston fern. You may have always wondered why Boston ferns were grown in Florida, but that's the reason. So you know how probably the garden center or the garden club ladies Mrs. Jackson got one Boston fern and Mrs. Johnson had to have two. So it became very popular in the Boston area, and that's where it got its name from. So I've been asked many times in my 30 years, why is the nursery industry so concentrated in the Apopka in the Zellwood and the Apopka area. And the reason is it goes back to that Boston fern, believe it or not. Because the Boston fern, eventually, there's a whole backstory about how it got here, who started the Boston industry in this area, and time won't allow me to tell all that tonight, so we'll do that another night. But the reason that the nursery industry got started in Apopka and Zellwood and Plymouth is because of the Boston fern. It started being grown in slat sheds here in the area, and this would have been in the early 20s. And I have a sample table in the hallway out there. There's an old picture of a slat shed, if you don't know what a slat shed looks like. But the ferns at that time were grown in ground beds in those slat sheds. They would pull the fern off. It actually have a runner, and the fern would grow along that runner. They would pull those off. They would pack them with sphagnum, moist sphagnum moss, wrap them in newspaper, put them in a wooden crate, and then they were shipped north on the railway, probably the same railway that Charlie was just talking about. So there were some other Vincents that were really prominent in the fernery business at the time in Zellwood. Riesling Sr. had three brothers, Jim, George, and Lester. And they also had a fernery, and I talked to Miss Vincent earlier, and she said it was down on the west end of Pond Can Road, in that area down there was where they had the fernery. So one of the biggest reasons they were so prominent in the fern industry, they were the first people to start a fern growers co-op in Zellwood. So not only were they selling their ferns, but they were also selling ferns from like 21 other growers, I think it says. So if you knew what the nursery industry was like in the late 60s and 70s and even into the 80s in the Apopka area, you knew that the nursery business was a huge thing. It actually was called the indoor foliage capital of the world at that time. But that is the reason that the nursery industry got started, was the start of the fern industry. So as time went on, there were so many ferneries that started cropping up in the area that they all were kind of competing with each other. So ferns was being overproduced. So the ferneries, trying to stay viable as a business, started thinking of other alternative crops to grow because ferns weren't selling quite as well as they should have been at the time. So that's when you start seeing the transition into the nursery business. This was about the time that cut ferns were starting to be grown. This was about the time also that tropical plants were introduced into the area. There were some growers that had gone down to South America, Central America, brought back exotic tropicals, and found out that you could also grow those in slat sheds the same as you could the ferns. So this kind of, you see, is a transition from the ferny business into the nursery business. So the fern growers began to grow other products. This was also about the same time that the stock market crashed and the economy started to tank. So that's why people started transitioning away from ferns into the nursery business. And as you've heard before, I said that the Apopka area was the tropical plant industry capital of the world. So that is the reason, the biggest reason is because of the fern industry and how it started. And with that, like Paul Harvey used to say, you know the rest of the story.